one important context for this research is that this is not a prediction or a projection. What we instead did was rely on a scenario, a net zero 2050 scenario from the Network for Greening the Financial System, a consortium of central banks that has developed scenarios for risk and opportunity analysis. So think about this as a scenario-based a simulation to allow us to understand the nature and magnitude of economic shifts so we can best put in place this response that I talked about towards an orderly transition. So with that, what did we actually find? We've synthesized our research in good McKinsey fashion into a framework of 6 characteristics. What we see from these characteristics, and I'll talk through each of them in detail on the next slide, is that the characteristics range from the transition being universal, significant, front-loaded, uneven, exposed to risks, but also rich with opportunities. Now, one way to think about this is a wonky list of characteristics, but actually if you stop and look at each one of them, what they suggest is both the nature as well as magnitude of transition shifts that are needed, and then through that help inform the nature and magnitude of the response that is needed across stakeholders. So let's now dive into each of these in turn. Let's start with the first one, which is that the transition is universal. Now, there's many ways to think about the transition being universal, but one way to think about it is the scale of shift that is needed across energy and land use systems. What you see on this slide as columns is the various energy and land use systems that contribute to emissions today, everything from power all the way to agriculture and forestry on the very right. What you see as rows is the various greenhouse gases that are emitted as a result of the activities in these systems, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. And the bubbles then indicate the share of emissions in each of the rows. So think about the rows as adding up to 100%. Now, when you look at this slide, one thing immediately jumps out at you, which is that there is no column where there is not a substantially sized bubble across at least one of the 3 greenhouse gases on this slide. And so what that means is that the net zero transition will not happen until and unless each and every one of these systems substantially transforms. We need decarbonization and transformation to some degree across every one of these systems for us to get to net zero. What one also realizes is that if you think about each of these systems, underpinning each of these systems is a set of sectors and countries that contribute to emissions, participate in these systems either directly or indirectly. So for example, if you think about mobility, the mobility system consists of everything from steel manufacturing to automotive manufacturing to parts suppliers to consumers at the end of that value chain. And so not only will each and every one of these systems need to transform, we will also need every sector of the economy, every country of the economy to participate in this universal transformation. The second feature we examine is the significance of the transition. We find that the scale of the transition is significant. And you see that on the next slide, where we examine the scale of capital spending as one example of the significance. If you think about the capital that needs to be deployed towards the transition on physical assets for these energy and land use systems, today we spend about $5.7 trillion on the physical assets that are utilized in these systems. Fast forward to the transition, what we find is that on average, about $9.2 trillion will need to be spent every year for the next 30 years in this NGFS Net Zero 2050 scenario. That is a scale up of $3.5 trillion of spending. So relative to today, we'll have to spend every year an incremental $3.5 trillion with a T. We also considered an alternate scenario, so accounting for policies that governments have put in place today, accounting for spending that one would expect as a result of population and income growth. And what we find is in that scenario, relative to that scenario, the step up in spending is about $1 trillion. So depending on which baseline you use, the number is substantial, anywhere from $1 to $3.5 trillion of capital that we will need to deploy, financing that needs to be secured. So that is one challenge that we need to grapple with. I'll come back to the fact that it's also potentially an opportunity. But the scale of spending is not the only thing that makes this transformation significant. It's also the nature of that spending. You see a sliver on this chart that says reallocated to low emissions assets. What the net zero transition entails is a fundamental, not just scale up of spending, but a reallocation of spending from high emissions assets today to low emissions assets in the future. Today, we spend about 70% of that $5.7 trillion on high emissions assets. In the future, that number would need to be exactly reversed. We need to spend about 70% on low emissions assets. So it is both a scale up of spending, but also a reallocation of spending. Now, that's one aspect when it comes to the spending. The other thing to think about when it comes to the spending is what you see on the next slide, which is the front-loaded nature of the transition. I talked about the 9.2 and I described it as an average annual number, but in fact, that 9.2 will not be evenly spread across the years of the transition. What we find is that today we're spending about 6.8% of GDP on these physical assets across these energy and land use systems. That number would need to rise to about 9% by 2025 to 2030 before falling back down. So this is not an evenly spread out transition. We will need to make investments, deploy capital at speed and scale in the next decade to get us to that net zero path. And people have described this in various ways, but this analysis really underscores this. The next decade is decisive to get us to that net zero path. So we've talked about universal, we've talked about significant, we've talked about front-loaded. The fourth feature we identify is that the transition is uneven. And we see that as one example here across countries. This is a little bit of a busy chart, so to orient you for a moment, the y-axis of this chart is a score that we've created, a transition exposure score. It's the average of GDP, average share of GDP, capital stock, and jobs in the most exposed parts of the economy. Sectors that have high emissions themselves because of their operations, or their products have high emissions when used, or their supply chains have high emissions. So we see a transition exposure score ranging from 0 to 100, where 0 implies no exposure, 100 implies fully exposed. And then on the x-axis, we see GDP per capita. So staring at this chart, I think three insights really stand out. The first is that every country is exposed in some way, shape, or form. There's no country that has a transition exposure score of 0. So there's some degree of economic shift that each and every country will need to undertake. The second, though, is that this exposure is not evenly felt. There are some countries that are more exposed, relatively more exposed than other countries. And those countries broadly fall into two groups. The first, not surprisingly, is countries that are fossil dependent, where under a net zero transition, the shift of the economy may be relatively large. The second is developing countries, where a relatively large portion of the economy is in sectors like high emissions manufacturing, fossil-based power, etc. And so the second takeaway is that while every country is exposed in some way, that exposure will not be evenly distributed. And then the third takeaway is when you look at the colors on this chart, what we've indicated with the colors is the scale of physical risk, the scale and nature of physical risks that countries are exposed to. And so there are certain countries that face almost a double whammy of both exposure to the transition, but also rising physical risks. And we'll need to think about both investments towards the transition and economic diversification, but also think about their own adaptation investments. The last thing around countries is we've talked about the scale of overall investment and capital that needs to be deployed. For these two groups of countries, the developing and the fossil-based economies, they are also exposed because of the scale of capital that they will need to deploy. They will need to spend about 1.5 times the amount as a share of GDP relative to more advanced economies. And deploying that capital may be more challenging for these economies, as I'm sure we'll discuss more in the panel. If we move to the next slide, there's another aspect of unevenness that's important to highlight, which is unevenness across sectors. While the overall scale of job impacts we estimate from the transition is relatively small compared to many other transformations like automation, we estimate about 200 million jobs that could be gained, 185 million jobs that could be lost by 2050 under a net zero transition. That number itself does not fully describe the scale of the challenge under a net zero transition. The challenge is the reallocation of jobs that would need to take place across sectors as well as across geographies. So we see unevenness across countries, we see unevenness across sectors, and for stakeholders considering the economic and societal adjustments, factoring in this unevenness, finding ways to manage it will be important. The fifth characteristic is that the transition is exposed to risks. What we've described so far is economic and societal adjustments almost under a relatively orderly transition. But there are various reasons the transition could be much more disorderly and create a whole range of higher order, more substantial negative impacts that stakeholders will need to consider. Everything from supply chain constraints and volatility to the potential for labor market dislocation, stranded assets. And so in some sense, the right counterfactual is a counterfactual of an orderly versus a disorderly transition, and thinking about the economic and societal adjustments to drive us towards that more orderly transition. And that brings me then to our final feature. One way to think about the counterfactual, as I said, is a counterfactual of a disorderly transition. There's another way to think about a counterfactual, which is the counterfactual of rising physical risk. So perhaps the biggest opportunity from the transition, or the biggest benefit from the transition, is the fact that we reduce the odds of initiating the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. There's also a whole range of near-term economic opportunities that we've identified in the research that emerge as we make the scale of capital spending that I described previously. And that ranges from everything from the potential for lower operating costs from some decarbonization actions to entirely new markets and products that get created. And then finally, the entire ecosystem that exists around a net zero economy, from new forms of inputs to services like risk management and financing services. There's both benefits in terms of avoided physical risks, but also near-term economic opportunities that stakeholders can look to capture.
So Mekala, this was quite a lot for all of us to process, and I know it's a few hundred pages summarized in just 6. I think we're good to transition to the panel, which will be hosted by Gillian Tett, chair of the editorial board of the FT, she will introduce what I think is a fantastic panel to react to this and bring perspective on the feasibility of this net zero transition. And you will be joining the panel to answer further questions, Mekala. Thank you. Over to you, Gillian.
Thank you very much indeed, Sven, and thank you very much indeed, Mekala, for that very authoritative presentation, which was delivered in a suitably calm manner, but actually has implications that should make everyone who's watching feel pretty terrified. Because it's not just the scale of the eye-poppingly large numbers that you presented, which are pretty shocking. It's the breadth of transition that's needed across the different economies. And in fact, one thing that does mark out your calculations and makes them different from most of the other existing calculations is you're not just looking at energy issues, you're looking at land use, you're looking at agriculture and things like that, which often get ignored. But the other point that's really pretty terrifying from what you've said is the gap between what has been pledged and what's actually been done, and the implications in terms of the disorderly transition of what will happen if we do not manage to close a gap. So pretty terrifying set of ideas embedded in that report. And we have a wonderful panel of people to talk about what they mean in practice and also what can be done in response during the discussion now. We've got Mark Carney, former governor of the Central Bank of England, who's the UN Special Envoy on Climate. We've got Francesco Starace, who is the CEO of Enel, the global utility. We've got Dr. Raj Shah, who's the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and Dickon Pinner, who's the global co-leader of the McKinsey Sustainability Group and also co-author of the report. And of course, we've got Mekala, who we can turn to drill down into any of the numbers in a suitably calm manner. So welcome to all of you, and I have a lot of questions I want to ask you. I'm sure the audience watching also have a lot of questions, so I would urge you to start sending in your questions right now if you do want to raise issues, because it gives me a sense of what you, the audience, really care about. I'm going to start weaving them in as we start in our conversation. But I'd like to start with a very simple but very scary number, which is 3.5 trillion, which is a gap in spending on activities which are sustainable. And there was a lot of discussion at the COP26 meeting in November in Glasgow about the finance, how you're going to get the world's biggest banks and financial institutions channeling their investments away from dirty to clean activities. But one of the key problems that has not been solved in any way, shape or form has been how you make that happen, not just in the developed world, where there's actually a lot of money already going into clean activities and green investments, but above all else into the emerging markets, the developing world. So I'd like to start with you, perhaps, Mark, and say, when you look at those numbers, first of all, do you think they are credible and realistic, because they're bigger than numbers we've seen before, financing gap? And what on earth can anyone do to actually get the money flowing to the emerging markets, because it's not flowing right now? Mark.
First out the gate. I know, terrible. Thank you, Gillian, and I'd like to commend McKinsey, Mekala, and Dickon for this work. First thing, and we worked closely with McKinsey in the run-up to COP26 on exactly this issue, the scale of capital need. So it's something that was front of mind, and I would say it focuses the mind. And it should focus the mind of companies and financial institutions. I want to say two things of context and then answer your question. The first is that 2 percentage point increase of GDP that Mekala referenced in terms of overall investment, that delta that comes up in the front-loaded element. Put it in context, that is the decline in investment relative to GDP that's happened since the 1990s with the dematerialization of growth. So this is something that's achievable. It's been achieved in the past. Orders of magnitude can be achieved. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but can be achieved. And then secondly, I think it's really important we think about flow of commitments. We have huge balance sheets that have been committed to finance net zero. So the question is, how much each year is actually being turned over and invested in net zero? Your question, how much of that is going to go to the emerging and developing world? By the middle of this decade, similar estimates would suggest we need an increase out of that $3.5 trillion. About a third of that is the increase needed for the emerging and developing world, ballpark. That is a big, big number. And our view has been the UK through the COP presidency and GFANZ is on record for this. The financial institutions is we need a new approach to the international financial architecture. Raj and others can speak more eloquently and directly to this, but in effect, we want a country platform type approach, which brings all forms of financing, public, blended, private sector financing that leverages private capital and is aligned with the transition to net zero. There are proposals that are starting to come together on that, but I'm glad you led with this because this is the year where we need to advance this agenda and not just talk about it, but advance it in a way that there are term sheets and financing flows.
Right, well, thank you. Well, Raj, I mean, you have a lot of experience, both in your current role with the Rockefeller Foundation, but previously as head of USAID, and trying to get money to move from the developed world to the developing world. Are you at all optimistic that, as Mark suggests, this is going to be the year when the world's leaders finally get their heads together and work out how to make that money flow? Because we've not seen it happen yet. And in many ways, it was one of the most disappointing aspects of the COP26 discussions, the lack of commitments on blended finance projects or any other channels and mechanisms to get the money to move.
Well, thank you, Gillian, and thanks to all the panelists for being with us, and congrats to McKinsey on a great analysis that's so important. Am I optimistic? I think to be in this industry and in this sector, you have to be an optimist. And so, yes, I'm optimistic. I think the reality is, the study basically calls for 3 to 10% of global GDP to be spent on this transition, some of that being additional, some of that being a trade-off against current spending. And I'd say the one big thing that I think has to be a bigger part of this conversation is another way to articulate what Mark just said about the emerging and developing world, which is there are 3.6 billion people that consume less than 1,000 kilowatt hours of energy per capita. That compares to 12,000 per person in the United States and some number just shy of that in the OECD overall. You cannot have a global transition for energy, food, and land use systems, which is really the main part of this vision forward, without some effort to include the hopes and aspirations of that 3.5 billion people on this planet. And you're right, it was the most difficult part of the Glasgow COP. It is embodied in this frustration around whether rich countries have really committed $100 billion to support the transition. But that's almost, frankly, a side issue compared to what needs to happen. What needs to happen is a massive public-private reimagining of how a clean energy future and a sustainable food future can lift up the hopes and aspirations of, in our case, 81 developing and emerging economies around the planet that over time will constitute the majority of global emissions, even though they don't today. It's why we launched an alliance called the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet. But in reality, we need many of these types of public-private alliances that can seriously finance the programs Mark just described as country platforms. That financing is not moving today, despite public commitments at Glasgow and elsewhere. And this has to be the year, with the Indonesians leading the G20 and a real focus on what it takes to execute the visions laid out at Glasgow, that we make real progress.
Well, you make a great point there. I mean, with the Indonesians leading the G20, and particularly Sri Mulyani, who has been such a powerful force inside the Bretton Woods institutions, and also in terms of engaging with China and other countries, we do probably have a better chance than for a long time of getting this kind of global cooperation. But before I turn to Dickon, I'd just like to ask you another question, Raj, which is that we're getting already a lot of questions from the audience about global cooperation. People just don't believe it's going to happen. You know, you've been in these meetings, you've sat in the US government on this point. Do you have any sign or any hope that, firstly, the US is going to provide more leadership on this issue, because it has been somewhat missing in action in the last couple of years? And secondly, do you actually think, looking at the question from the audience, we are going to see more global cooperation on this?
I absolutely think we will. And here's why. I think there's a recognition that the Bretton Woods institutions and the architecture created after World War II served its purposes in the first few decades after World War II, but is not currently scaled to the challenge that we face. And the numbers McKinsey presents shows the massive discrepancy. You know, those are not institutions capable of accelerating 3 to 4% of global GDP for investment in transitioning energy economies around the planet. So the gap is just so obvious today. The second reason is there's actually a geopolitical competition to fill that gap with whatever vision the competitors have. China is right now embarking on a Belt Road Initiative that I think is an example of what global cooperation will look like if other economies and other cooperative entities don't step up and do more. And so, spurred by that competitive threat, I think you will see the United States, the G20, the OECD step up with efforts to do much more. I think the other reason I'm optimistic is there are concrete signs of real progress. The South African country platform example, where $8.5 billion was committed to a pretty specific plan to decommission coal and expand in renewable energy, will, I think, be replicated this year for Indonesia. And, you know, you can look at 15 to 20 countries and add together what needs to happen and design country platforms that can actually execute. This is not imaginary work anymore. It just has to take place with an urgency we haven't seen to date.
Well, thank you, Raj. That's very helpful. I'm going to turn to the corporate sector in just a moment, but first I want to bring in Dickon here, because, you know, you are in an unusual position of being a dispassionate observer who's also privy to a lot of these discussions and numbers. In your view, what exactly is needed to channel money from the developed world to the developing world? And also, we're getting a lot of questions from the audience about cost of capital. What can be done to lower the cost of capital for the developing world? Because most of them simply cannot afford to pay the type of numbers that are out there right now in terms of the cost of capital in the markets.
Thank you, Gillian. I think actually building a little bit on Raj's comment around competitiveness, and I think some of the work that we did with Mark in the run-up to COP26, I think the numbers of sort of public versus private finance, I think it's, you know, private finance is going to do the majority of the lifting here, probably about 75%. Obviously, that varies significantly depending on, you know, the country it's going in. But the private finance thing is going to play a big role. And I think building on the competitiveness, there's national competitiveness issues, but the private sector is really stepping in, because with this type of money moving around, this will change the basis of competition across many, if not most, industries. So we are finding on the private side of things, or the company side, that you know, companies are looking at this as much as a kind of offense opportunity than a defense opportunity. Yes, you have a lot of compliance things to deal with, but this is, you know, this trillions of dollars will change the basis of competition. So that's kind of point one. I think point two, and I think Mark made this point with the GFAN's announcements at COP. You know, we now have, 450 institutions representing $130 trillion who are sort of notionally aligned. That doesn't mean the money is formed, but I think this is about the pipes and the markets to get the money from A to B. And we're actually seeing a few things happening that are sort of very positive. One, if we look at what's going on with voluntary carbon markets, we now have very strong demand from the corporate sector, and we've got a bit of a chicken and egg situation in terms of what it takes to scale up supply. But, if we could unlock things like voluntary carbon markets, that would move investment dollars from high carbon emitters to carbon removal. That also helps with investment flows going from the global north to the global south, and probably also stimulates the development of compliance markets down the road. Similarly, we're beginning to see, the role of insurance sort of stepping in and trying to underwrite balance sheets with strips of risk of some of these investments, or as Raj is doing, strips of philanthropic capital to try and, increase the concessionary or first loss capacity to get money into non-OECD countries. So it's a huge lift and requires sort of massive level of collaboration and cooperation. But our sense is hopefully by putting this type of granular analysis out, it actually helps those public-private partnerships begin to take hold with all the large amounts of private capital we see being formed, but still not quite having the pipes and markets to get from A to B.
Right. Well, thank you. Well, Francesco, you're representing the private sector here. I'm curious for two things. I'd like to ask you in a moment about public-private partnerships, but perhaps you can tell us first, we've seen the overarching picture of the reallocation that has to happen of investment across the economies as a whole. What does it mean for a company like Enel? How are you changing your investment in practical terms in response to these kinds of reports and scary numbers?
Well, we have changed it, I would say roughly 4 or 5 years ago in a big way, because we asked ourselves this question, which is very simple, and it is, what does it mean for us, this transition? What is the impact on our asset base? What is the value of assets we own vis-a-vis what's going on? And understanding what Mekala just said, this transition will happen anyway. So this is something that each company should understand. Can you actually think that this transition doesn't happen? It's not the case. It will happen. So in that light, just go in the future and see what is your asset base going to look like and what is the value of that legacy. And then we said it's best to really hurry up and completely shift our allocation of capital from carbon intensive to non-carbon assets. What we did is something kind of radical. We took the net word out of zero. So we said, we're just going to focus on zero carbon because there is so much to be done and so much innovation to be thrown at things and so much work to be really tackled that the net word is like, let's say, preventing innovation and focus on that front. We will leave it for a later date, this net stuff. So take the net word out and work on the zero basis only and look at all the environment. So customers, ourselves, suppliers, zero. That's the baseline, and we focused on that from the beginning. And of course, we had to establish metrics because without metrics, this doesn't work. And we had to link the risk management logic of the company with this new track that we established. And we had to link remuneration of management to this new track that we had established. What happened, the consequence of that is that in order to keep growing, we had to add 1 or 2 orders of magnitude to the numbers of opportunities we had to pursue. Before, these companies like utilities like us had 3, 4 very large projects in which we poured billions and billions and lasted years to be finished. Now we said we are not going to invest in anything that takes more than 2 or 3 years to be finished. And that means we had to all of a sudden deal with hundreds and hundreds of projects of smaller size. much more manageable, but of course, much more complex in their own system. That changed completely the organization. But the first real point was, can this be stopped? Can this be derailed? Can this transition not happen? And the answer is clearly not. It is going to happen. So then take the net out of zero and work on that.
So we have quite a few questions about just transition, which is one way to talk about jobs. So I'm curious, for a company like Enel, what does it mean on the ground in terms of who you're employing and who you're potentially having to let go? Because the overarching number from McKinsey is that, you're going to gain 200,000 but lose 185,000, which gives a very narrow net increase, which of course is crowd pleasing, but very painful for anyone who's on the wrong side of that equation. So tell us what it means in practical terms right now for Enel. Are you concerned about the just transition aspects of this?
We are concerned in the fact that we don't find enough people to drive this in the proper way. The issue is today, in the transition, if you move early, you find yourself in a confined space insofar resources are concerned, human resources, people that have the skill and the understanding of the complexity of the transition that can drive this business forward. So that's the constraint we face today. It's a talent constraint in terms of getting the right people in the right numbers in the early enough in the curve so that you can really move fast. If I had to tell you today, the constraint to our evolution and the growth in that sector is not capital. It is not the space of growth or the opportunities for that, because the space is expanding rapidly. It's the number of skilled people you can put together at work and manage properly and retain, because there is a huge war for talent. So we have not had that impact because we moved early. What we did is we retrained a lot of people. We retrained literally thousands of our people that were working on assets that are no more competitive, and we had to retrain them. But that has not been a problem. It's completely possible. And by the way, I would add, it was expected. I mean, people on the shop floor know things earlier than management by far.
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, one of the points that comes out of the report very strongly is that in some ways this is comparable to what happened in the Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely.
The shift of people moving from agriculture into the urban jobs. It may not actually be as big a transition, but it can be managed. We can see through history how it does happen, even though there are painful dislocations along the way. But one other quick question while I've got you, Francesco, and I want to turn back to Dickon, is one of the other points that Mekala said in her presentation is that in many ways the innovations we need are already there. Would you agree, or do you think we need a lot more innovation to come? I think you might be on mute, Francesco.
Yeah, I think they muted me. Yeah.
No, one of the innovations we all need is a way to switch mute on and off just with a blink of an eye.
I agree with Mekala completely. It is this innovation that we need now is here. We have it. I think what we need to innovate is the way in which we manage innovation. That needs to be innovated. The innovation we need must be understanding of problems we cannot solve and going outside of our own comfort zone to look at solutions and then share them. I think this is a moment in which innovation must be shared. This is not anymore a point that you can drive on your own, on your small, large, very large innovation or R&D environment and really succeed. So what needs to be innovated here is the concept of innovation that we really want to drive in this business. We think it's the biggest opportunity we have today is that circulate much more innovation and ask for help for any problems that you cannot solve, because that help is there. There is an incredible opportunity, provided you are candid and say, I cannot solve this, please come and help. And people will do that.
Well, that's quite a change from the 20th century way of thinking in business, whereby if you get a great innovation, you keep it to yourself at all costs. So again, it's another sign of the kind of mental shift that's going on. But Dickon, I'd like to come back to you with a different question, which has been asked a lot by the audience, and we've written a lot about it at the FT and the Moral Money platform, which covers ESG. Carbon prices. Can any of this transition happen without the world's leaders getting real about the need to embrace carbon prices and carbon taxes, in your view?
Well, I think the good news is that many of our clients, and I think the private sector is already using carbon prices internally to make their decisions. And I think, to Francesco's point, that then has an impact on the duration of the assets, depending on the carbon intensity that you're willing to invest in. So, for example, in oil and gas, you see a lot of investment going into the Permian, for example, in the US, which is a very short cycle, and you can get your money back in 5 years or so. So we do see sort of shadow carbon prices. And then I think, as we were talking earlier, the advent of voluntary carbon markets is also bringing in carbon prices on a voluntary basis. Sort of an extraordinary thing that companies are doing this of their own free will. And we think that will be a prequel over time to compliance markets, which will be required for, you will need a carbon price to decarbonize the steel sector or the cement sector, or aluminum, etc. These sectors at the moment all need that type of cover to create the investment potential. But even in the absence of those compliance markets existing, we're already seeing capital beginning to move on the basis that that's what the direction of travel will be. And I think if you're a CEO of a business, that's part of the art here, right? Which is you have to have a view on where the puck is headed. And you have to do that at what we call like a full potential analysis of your portfolio. What are the risks and opportunities that it confronts? And then start to make some bets on things that are economic today, but also start to lean forward on the basis of where technology and policy is headed in the future. And we put this a little bit in the framing of this is sort of strategy under certain volatility and uncertainty, but you need to have a view of where things are headed and start to sort of invest cautiously, but with the sort of confidence in what some of those futures look like.
Well, Francesco, do you have a carbon price, a shadow carbon price for Enel's operations, and what is it?
We live in a carbon priced environment. In any case, power is carbon priced from the beginning of the ages. So yes, when we take an investment decision, we have our own carbon pricing system, if that was the question. But that is basically almost useless at this point, because most of the geographies where we use to work have carbon pricing established that are, real carbon pricing. So we had it at the very beginning, but it's less and less important because it's already, in our sector, most of the times it's already there.
Right. Mekala, just before I turn to Mark Carney for another question, you're in charge of all the numbers and the graphs. Do you have a back-of-the-envelope calculation for what the carbon price should be to get us anywhere near where we need to be?
No, that was actually not something we looked at, partly because we don't take a stand on policy. I do want to build on something that Dickon said, which I think is really important. I think it's the debate on capital flows on the net zero transition can often become just about the carbon price, right? And I think it's important to recognize the carbon price is a tool in the toolbox. It's important because it drives demand signals, it creates the right incentives. It's particularly important, as Dickon said, for hard-to-abate sectors. But I think it's vital to recognize it is not by any means the only tool in the toolbox or the most essential tool necessarily in the toolbox. I mean, we've been talking about the just transition, things like reskilling workers, things like economic diversification for the most affected communities, things like how companies can actually do risk analysis and understand where the puck is skating. There's, I mean, a whole bunch of things that are needed in terms of corporate action as well as government action that extend well beyond a carbon price. And so I really do think that the debate needs to be broadened beyond that single tool in the toolbox, and that there's many more, probably more important tools.
Right. Just before I turn to Mark Carney, I can see that Raj was trying to get in on the carbon price issue. I'm curious, given that you look at emerging markets, you're championing a lot of emerging market situations. Are you in favor of, say, putting a lower carbon price for developing world, or even, to go back to a question that's been asked quite a few times, creating different timeframes for transition in the developing world?
Well, I'm sorry to jump in. I just wanted to highlight that next year relative to this year, we're going to have more coal. And the year after that, we're going to have more coal. And there's 110 gigawatts of new coal, kind of part of the Belt Road Initiative, coming online in emerging markets. So yes, I do think you need a carbon pricing structure that's more effective at shifting incentives everywhere on the planet. And I also believe you need some sort of accommodation for countries that have a very high share of their population consuming less than, say, what a lot of people think is the productive minimum of 1,000 kilowatt hours a year. It is, however, the case that renewable technology deployed aggressively can actually reach those 3.6 billion people I mentioned that live at under 1,000 kilowatt hours a year more effectively, more efficiently than building new coal and tying it to grids. But right now we have a massive subsidy and a massive policy support regime that supports building new coal and tying it to massive grids that never even reach lower income communities. We need a massive public-private rethink of that is invested in with hundreds of billions of dollars of public and private capital to change that equation.
Right. I see that before I get to Mark, I see Francesco's worked out how to use a tech and raise his hand on screen.
Yes.
No one else has done yet, so congratulations. You've shown us you're a tech-savvy CEO.
No, I just on this issue of carbon pricing, I think what Rajiv just said makes sense. I mean, first of all, you should understand there is a lot of emerging markets that have fossil fuels incentives. So they are incentivizing the wrong stuff. They are subsidizing the wrong stuff. Number one observation. Number two, I think there will be eventually carbon pricing in most places of the world, not necessarily at the same aligned value. So I would argue today that if we had a carbon pricing mechanism in the US, it would not be needing to reach the levels of carbon pricing we have in Europe to be effective, because of differences between the environmental and also the industrial base that you have to modify. So to have a single carbon pricing around the world is completely crazy. To have different carbon pricing areas makes a lot of sense. They should then, it will be fantastic for people that will then establish correlations and arbitrage between different carbon values. But the one carbon market of the world, I think it's an abstraction, basically.
Well, Mark, I'd like to bring you in at this point, because we know from our readers at Moral Money that whenever we mention the word carbon price or carbon offsets, we get passionate engagement. People really care about this because they're trying to figure it out. So I'm sure you have comments on this. So do jump in and say a few things about this. But also, I'd like to ask a question that the audience has asked and is very popular, which is this. Should transition plans apply to both private and public sector companies? Are we in danger of putting all the burden on the private sector companies and ignoring private companies?
Yeah. Short answer is yes. They should apply to all companies. And look, let's take stock of where we were 2 years ago. 2 years ago, nobody talked about transition plans. Very few people talked about net zero pathways. I mean, things have moved. They've got to move a lot more. But I'm glad that sort of sophistication of that question is being asked. The answer is yes for both. Let me make a couple other points, though, around it. It is not the case that you can hide in, if you are a private company, away from the glare, if you will, or the application of net zero aligned capital, unless you're not going to borrow any money. We have all the world's systemic banks are aligning to net zero. Anything they lend to a private company they own those emissions, in effect. That's what PCAF emissions standards mean. And that's the system that's being designed. Now, I wouldn't rely only on that, and that's why we should have all public and private companies, but with those plans. Second point is that, normally with reforms, what you do is you start with the largest, most sophisticated companies, and then you move it up the chain. So it is natural to start public, move it into private, but you've got that other dynamic. Let me say just, I know time's short, so I'll say a couple of quick points. I had a very rich discussion around carbon pricing, agree with the differential point, everything Francesco and Raj said. The answer to your question on the number is somewhere, though, around 100 by the end of the decade. And that can be a blend of carbon price and regulation, which would be the case. I do think that the offset market has a complementary role to play here. It is by no means, and Dickon wasn't suggesting it, that it's the core, but it has a complementary role, including scaling up private capital into, and again, the key point, it's going from high emission companies to the countries that need the money. But just quickly on cost of capital, because you asked that and I'll be quiet. The ways to get the cost of capital for the emerging developing world down are, one, blended finance, properly scaled, that truly leverages. I'll reference, not just because he's here, but Raj and the Rockefeller Initiative at COP, which uses philanthropic capital. Fantastic. We should be using public multilateral development bank balance sheets for that in a way that can scale on an order of magnitude. That's the kind of reform and discussion we need this year. In addition, and this is a key point, which is that you're getting now large asset managers, asset owners, banks who are looking for the first time for net zero aligned assets. And that includes in emerging and developing world very much. So if you're in a country platform like the South African deal, if I can put it that way, that was done at COP, others that hopefully will be done for Sharm el-Sheikh, COP27, and those are high ambition transitions. In other words, becoming aligned with Paris, then if I'm lending to projects that are consistent with that or investing in those projects, they are net zero aligned. And this is me helping the transition in the emerging and developing world, which helps with first availability, but also cost of capital. So it does all, as you know better than anyone, Jillian, it all links together. And I'll stop on this, compliment again McKinsey for pulling together the orders of magnitude here so that we can concentrate on the big initiatives that chip away at that extra $3.5 trillion that the world's got to find.
Right. We've had a lot of questions, Mark, about changing nature of relationship between the different stakeholders, public, private, NGO worlds. Do you think we're going to have to reimagine how these interact? Because we've already had this very interesting comment from Francesco that innovation isn't something that any one company hugs anymore. It needs to be more widely shared. But I'm just curious whether you think we really are at a transition moment for that stakeholder interaction right now.
I think I'll make 2 points on that. One, the interaction has shifted because, if I can put it this way, the stakeholders, or more accurately society, has decided that we value sustainability. We value getting to 1.5 degrees. That's why governments have had to move in the end. Now it's the job of the rest of us to organize ourselves so that we can help deliver that around the world. And then secondly, as Francesco was alluding to, this and the McKinsey report's littered with it, this requires system change. System change in the energy sector, system change across industrial sectors, across agriculture, across trade. And no one company can do it on their own. They can't appropriate it. There's huge externalities. And that's where the sharing of the approach really starts to come in. But to be clear, there will be winners and losers, even with the system change. There will be those, not just because he's here, like NL, who move early, who think about it early, who get the people, who get the resources, who move, versus others. But they too need the system as a whole to change. And of course, the financial system has to be a core participant in that. And with your point, with other stakeholders, understanding what the other stakeholders want so the system change happens.
Right. Well, thank you. Sadly, we're almost out of time. We've got masses of brilliant questions. It shows just how much people are really engaging in this topic right now. But I'd like to perhaps finish with a quick question, maybe for Dickon or for Mekala, which is really been asked many, many times by the audience. And it's roughly this. The transition is big. That's an understatement. Has the global economy world ever successfully undergone such a transition in such a time? Existing sectors and functions have been in place for centuries. And as you say, a transformation is needed in a decade to achieve 1.5 degrees target. Is it at all possible to have the transition we need if you look back at history? Dickon, you can throw this over to Mekala, who's in charge of the charts, or you can jump in. But either way, I think the McKinsey geeks should tell us, do we have any chance whatsoever of getting there? Or give us a probability or a flowchart.
I would say it's a very significant challenge, but it's doable. I would also say don't underestimate human ingenuity and innovation. And in a highly constrained problem, you find answers. As you said, this is an economy that took 1 to 2 centuries to build, and we will try and sort of rebuild it in the next 3 decades. I think that the key risk to manage is, and Mekala mentioned this is a transition, not a switch. And the danger is that you don't invest into the install base, instead you divest, and that you end up with kind of volatility and price fly-ups that would lead to a disorderly transition. I think our hope is by putting this work out into the public domain, it gives all stakeholders a bit of a roadmap and a set of tools. Foresight is a gift, and our sense is that this, the prize is so large and the counterfactual is so terrible to want to avoid that we're quite optimistic that this will happen. But it's a massive system lift. But Mekala, would you add to that?
Yeah, maybe just to get a little bit wonky on economic history and theory. I mean, we have been through transitions in the past, right? And Raj alluded to this. We've been through the Industrial Revolution. We've gone through globalization. So economic transformation is a part of our lives. So in some sense, this is similar to many of the transitions we've gone through in the past. I think there's 3 important differences, and a lot of the measures we've talked about here, I think, help inform how to manage those differences. One is indeed the fact that this is uneven. The costs will not be evenly borne, and the very stakeholders that we need to have transform often bear costs. And so that creates an incentive challenge we need to deal with. I think the second, as Mark has frequently spoken about, is this idea of the tragedy of the horizons, the need to act now for benefits in the future and how we actually overcome that. And then the third, if I could call it that, is the tragedy of inertia. We have systems that function today, and many people are happy with how they're functioning. And so we need to overcome the inertia that exists in those systems. But again, many of the measures we've talked about today, and I love Francesco's point about companies recognizing that the transition is in some sense inevitable. If we think about the counterfactual of an inevitable transition or the counterfactual of a disorderly transition, that does create the imperative to act right now. So some similarities, some differences that mean the need for different types of action.
So there is still reason for hope. Sven, do you want to finish us off and tell us why we should have reason for hope?
Thank you, Gillian, and thank you, Mark, Francesco, Rajiv, Dickon, and of course Mekala. I think putting out the size of this transition into the room, as Mark said, focuses the mind, and it will help focus, I hope, all leaders around the world to put it to grips and size it up and face the bull by the horn, if you want to call it that way. And in that sense, it would then not be scary because it is becoming tangible. And I think the tangibility of the discussion in the last 2 to 3 years has dramatically changed. And I would say if you extrapolate that speed, there's way more speed to come. It's exponential at the moment. So we'll see where that then ends. But this will focus the mind. I would really like to thank you all for participating in this virtual event. If you want to download some of the material to help you focus the mind on the size of the transition, it's available on mckinsey.com. And at the end of this, I also would like you to give us some feedback, whether this is a format that works. There will be a 3-part question. And again, thank you to the panel for a great conversation.